The sky above the little town of Briar's Hollow stretched wide and pale like a sheet hung out to dry. Dawn had only just finished whispering its way across the prairie, and the wind moved low over the grass as if it carried secrets from one lonely fence post to the next. Dust drifted along the main road in soft sighs. Wooden buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, their paint worn thin by sun and winter. The church bell had rung an hour earlier, its echo still clinging faintly to the morning air. Outside the chapel, beneath a crooked cottonwood tree, stood a line of children. Some were tall enough to hide their fear behind stiff backs and tight jaws. Some were too young to understand the shape of the day. And at the far end of that line stood a girl no older than 10, small but determined to look unbreakable. Her name was Eliza May. Her dress had been mended more times than it had been washed. The hem sat uneven, and one sleeve carried a patch stitched by careful hands. Mrs. Hale from the orphan house had sewn it the night before and told her in a voice that carried both hope and warning. "Stand straight, child." Even wildflowers leaned toward the sun. Eliza stood straight now, but her hands trembled inside her sleeves. She had learned something about trembling. It could be hidden if you kept your elbows close and your chin lifted, just so. She had practiced that look in the cracked mirror by the wash basin. Hope, she knew, was a dangerous thing. It rose quickly and fell harder than any bruise. The chapel doors opened slowly. Townsfolk stepped out into the yard in pairs and clusters. Boots scraped the dirt. Hats were adjusted. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men surveyed the children with practical eyes. In frontier towns like Briar's Hollow, children were not only blessings. They were help. They were hands for harvest. They were bodies to carry water and mend fences. Eliza kept her eyes forward. The first family approached a pair of sturdy twin boys. Questions were asked. Shoulders were squeezed. A nod passed between husband and wife. The boys were led away, their faces pale with disbelief. Eliza allowed herself a small smile for them. One by one, children were chosen. A red-haired girl with freckles left with a seamstress from town. A solemn boy with large ears went with the blacksmith. Even little Thomas, who stuttered when frightened, was gathered up by a widow who needed quiet company. The line grew shorter. The air grew heavier. Then he arrived. Mr. Horace Calloway, owner of the largest cattle spread for 50 miles. His boots shone despite the dust. His coat was cut from fine cloth, though he wore it loosely, as if wealth sat naturally upon his shoulders. He walked the line slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He paused in front of Eliza. She felt his shadow first. It fell over her shoes and crept upward like a warning. He studied her the way a rancher studies a colt at market. "Turn around," he said, not unkindly but without warmth. She obeyed. "Too small," he muttered. "Looks delicate." His wife gave Eliza a sympathetic glance, but said nothing. Mr. Calloway shook his head. "I need strong boys. Winter's coming early this year." And just like that, he moved on. Eliza returned to facing forward. She kept her chin high. She swallowed carefully, so no one would see the way disappointment lodged itself like a stone in her throat. She had not expected him to choose her. Still, something in her had hoped. The wind picked up, tugging at her skirt. It felt almost cruel, as if even the air meant to remind her how easily small things could be blown aside. Soon there were only 3 children left. Then 2. Then 1. The yard emptied slowly. Families departed with careful smiles and uncertain futures. Mrs. Hale stood near the chapel door, hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Eliza was alone beneath the cottonwood tree. The silence pressed against her ears. She had imagined this moment before. Imagined walking back to the orphan house with careful steps, telling herself it did not matter. Imagined Mrs. Hale's soft apology and the other children trying not to stare. "Nobody picked me." The words echoed in her mind, though no one had spoken them aloud. She felt smaller now, not in body, in spirit, as if each departing wagon had carried away a piece of her courage. A boot scuffed the dirt behind her. She did not turn immediately. There was dignity even in disappointment. But when the sound did not fade, she slowly lifted her eyes. A man stood near the chapel steps. He had not joined the crowd earlier. He had remained near the doorway, hat in his hands, watching with a quiet stillness that felt different from the others. Dust clung to the edges of his trousers. His shirt was plain, sleeves rolled neatly to strong forearms browned by sun. His boots bore scuffs that told stories of long rides and longer days. He did not look wealthy. He did not look hurried. His gaze met hers without flinching. There was no measuring in it, no weighing, no calculation, only recognition. Mrs. Hale cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Reed," she said, "are you still considering?" He nodded once. His name was Samuel Reed. Some in town called him Sam. Others simply tipped their hats when he passed and left it at that. He owned a modest spread on the far edge of Briar's Hollow, a small ranch with more wind than cattle and more work than help. He stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. Eliza felt her pulse in her fingertips. He stopped an arm's length away. "You are Eliza May," he said gently. She nodded. He crouched slightly, not enough to seem dramatic, just enough so his eyes met hers without towering above. "You stood the whole morning?" he observed, even when the others shifted. She was unsure how to answer. It felt like a test. "I did not want to seem weak," she finally said, her voice barely stronger than a breeze. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not amusement. Approval. "Strength isn't the absence of shaking," he said. "It's standing anyway." Mrs. Hale watched with cautious hope. Samuel rose to his full height. He removed his hat completely, holding it against his chest. "I have room," he said quietly. "Not a grand house, just a steady one, and I could use another pair of careful hands." He paused. "If she is willing." Eliza blinked. No one had asked her willingness before. Mrs. Hale stepped closer. "That is kind of you, Mr. Reed. Are you certain?" He looked at Eliza again. "Yes." A long silence passed. The town square seemed to hold its breath. And then, without flourish, without raised voice or dramatic gesture, Samuel Reed lifted his hand slightly and said, "She will come with me." Simple words, but they carried weight. Eliza's knees felt uncertain. The world tilted slightly, as if her understanding of it had shifted. "Nobody picked me." The thought dissolved. Someone had. Not because she was the strongest. Not because she would bring status. Not because she was easy. Because she stood straight while trembling. Mrs. Hale placed a gentle hand on Eliza's shoulder. "Child," she whispered, "gather your things." Eliza's fingers loosened from the tight hold on her sleeves. She had not realized how firmly she had been gripping them. She studied Samuel once more, searching for signs of regret. There were none, only patience. The cottonwood leaves rustled overhead, no longer sounding like mockery, but like quiet applause. As they walked toward the waiting wagon at the edge of the road, Eliza kept a small distance between them, not from mistrust alone, but from unfamiliarity. Belonging was not something she knew how to carry yet. Samuel opened the wagon door and stepped aside, allowing her to climb in first. "After you." The words startled her more than the adoption itself. She settled onto the wooden seat, heart still uncertain whether this was real or some fragile dream that might dissolve by sundown. He climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. The horses shifted, impatient for direction. Eliza looked back once at the chapel, at the cottonwood tree, at the empty yard where she had stood alone. It already felt like another lifetime. Samuel clicked his tongue softly, and the wagon began to roll forward. Dust rose behind them like a curtain closing on a scene. Eliza folded her hands at her lap. She did not speak. Neither did he. But somewhere beneath the fear and disbelief, beneath the careful wall she had built to survive disappointment, a small and fragile warmth began to glow. Someone had raised his hand, and this time it had not been lowered. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain beneath the endless western sky. And for the first time in her young life, Eliza did not feel entirely unseen. The wagon rolled away from Briar's Hollow, as if it, too, understood the sacredness of quiet moments. No one spoke. The wheels turned slow against the dry earth, carving twin lines into the road that stretched toward the open prairie. Dust lifted in soft spirals behind them, then settled again as though reluctant to follow. Eliza sat stiffly on the wooden bench, hands folded in her lap the way Mrs. Hale had taught her. Her small suitcase rested at her feet, its leather worn thin at the corners. Everything she owned fit inside it. 2 dresses, a hair ribbon, a tin button she had once found near the well and decided was lucky. Beside her, Samuel Reed held the reins loosely. He did not crowd her with questions. He did not fill the air with promises. He let the silence breathe. The prairie opened wide before them, tall grass bending in waves like the surface of a restless sea. The sky felt larger out here, unbroken by rooftops and chimneys. A hawk circled high above, tracing slow circles in the blue. After a while, Samuel reached beneath the bench and pulled out a canteen. He unscrewed the cap and held it toward her first. Water. She blinked at the gesture. At the order of it, she accepted the canteen carefully, mindful not to spill. The water was cool and tasted faintly of tin. It slid down her throat and eased something tight inside her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once and drank after her. The road curved gently east. She studied him in quiet glances. His jaw was firm but not severe. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, not from frowning but from squinting into sun and wind. His hands were large, scarred in places where rope had burned or wood had splintered. He looked like a man built for endurance. She wondered if endurance meant kindness. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain that never quite arrived. "How far is your ranch?" she asked finally, surprised by her own voice. "A few hours more," he replied. "Not far in miles. Far enough in quiet." She did not know what that meant, but she liked the sound of it. They passed a narrow creek where water moved lazily over stones. Samuel slowed the horses and let them drink. Eliza watched the reflection of sky ripple in the current and thought about how easily images could break apart and form again. They resumed their journey. By late afternoon, the sun hung low and golden, spilling honeyed light across the land. In the distance, she saw it, a modest homestead resting against a stretch of open fields, a barn with faded red paint peeling like old scabs, a windmill creaking gently in the breeze, a small house with a porch that leaned slightly to the left as if tired but unwilling to fall. It was not grand. It was not polished. It was steady. "This is home," Samuel said quietly. The word landed carefully between them. "Home." He guided the wagon toward the house and climbed down first. Then he turned and offered his hand. She hesitated only a second before placing her fingers in his palm. His grip was firm but gentle, as though he understood how easily small things could bruise. Her boots touched the ground. The air smelled different here, less crowded, more open, like the land itself had room to breathe. The front door creaked as it opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was older, with silver hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Her eyes were sharp but kind, the kind that noticed more than they spoke. "Well now," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "So this is the young lady." Eliza straightened instinctively. "Mrs. Carter," Samuel said. "She lives a mile west. Keeps an eye on things when I'm away." Mrs. Carter descended the porch steps and studied Eliza not with inspection, but with interest. "You look like you've weathered more than your share of wind, child," she said softly. Eliza did not know whether to nod or deny it. Mrs. Carter smiled gently. "You'll find the wind don't bite as hard out here." Behind the barn, a lanky young man emerged, carrying a bundle of fence posts on his shoulder. "That's Benji," Samuel explained. "Helps when he remembers how." Benji grinned sheepishly. "Ma says I forget more than I remember." Mrs. Carter shot him a look that held affection beneath its scolding. Eliza watched this exchange quietly. There was no grandeur here, no polished speeches, just ordinary life unfolding in plain daylight. Samuel carried her suitcase inside. The house was simple, a wooden table scarred by years of meals and mending, a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with jars of preserved peaches and beans, a small bookshelf near the window, holding a handful of worn volumes. He led her down a narrow hallway. "This room is yours," he said, opening a door. The space was small but clean. A narrow bed stood against the wall, covered in a patchwork quilt of faded blues and soft creams. A wash basin rested on a wooden stand. A single window looked out toward the fields. She stepped inside slowly. Yours. The word felt fragile. If you'd like it to be, he added, as though understanding how easily ownership could frighten someone who had never known it. She ran her fingers over the quilt. It was not new, but it was warm. Thank you, she said, the words barely steady. He nodded once. Supper's at sundown. No hurry. And then he left her alone. She stood in the center of the room, listening to the quiet hum of wind outside. No distant shouting. No crowded dormitory. No echo of restless children shifting in their sleep. Only stillness. That night, they ate stew at the kitchen table. Benji spoke of a fence that refused to remain upright. Mrs. Carter mentioned the price of flour rising in town. Samuel listened more than he talked. Eliza answered questions politely but sparingly. She waited for something to change, for expectations to surface, for rules to tighten. But none came. After supper, Samuel cleared his plate and washed it without comment. He showed her where the extra blankets were kept. He did not instruct her how to behave or what to call him. You may rest early if you wish, he said. She nodded and retreated to her room. The bed creaked softly beneath her weight. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling beams. The quiet was almost too much. At the orphan house, silence had meant loneliness. Here it felt different. Not empty, just wide. Sometime in the night, thunder rolled across the prairie. It came low and heavy, like distant wagons rumbling over stone. Rain began to fall, tapping against the window in uneven rhythm. Eliza jolted awake. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The storm grew louder. Wind rattled the shutters. Lightning flashed pale blue across the walls. Her breath quickened. Storms had always meant uncertainty. Leaky roofs, cold drafts, children crying in the dark. She slipped from bed and padded toward the door. Before she could open it, a soft glow appeared beneath the crack. A lantern. Samuel's voice came low and steady from the other side. It's just weather, Eliza. The house has stood through worse. He did not open the door. He did not step inside uninvited. He simply sat there. The lantern light flickered gently against the floorboards. You are safe here, he added. 3 words. Simple, but they settled into her bones differently than any promise she had heard before. She returned to bed, still uncertain, but less afraid. The storm passed before dawn. When morning came, the prairie glistened beneath fresh rain. Drops clung to the fence posts like scattered pearls. The air smelled clean and new. Eliza stepped outside cautiously. Samuel stood near the barn, hammer in hand, repairing a loosened plank as if storms were ordinary visitors. He glanced up and saw her watching. Morning, he said. She nodded. The sunlight touched her face, warming it gently. For the first time since the chapel yard, her hands did not tremble. Not completely, but less. She stood there, observing him as he worked, steady, unhurried, unbothered by the previous night's thunder. And somewhere deep inside her, a question began to form. What if this was not temporary? What if belonging was not something that vanished with the next storm? She did not know yet, but she felt the faintest shift inside her chest, like a door unlatched just slightly. The prairie stretched wide around the small ranch, endless and patient. And Eliza, standing beneath the vast morning sky, began to wonder if perhaps she, too, might learn the shape of staying. Autumn arrived without announcement. It slipped into the fields on quiet feet, brushing the tall grasses with gold and copper until the land itself looked dipped in honey. The wind changed its voice, no longer restless but thoughtful, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and drying hay. Time moved differently on Samuel Reed's ranch. Days were not counted by clocks, but by chores finished and sunsets survived. Eliza began to understand that rhythm the way one learns the steady beat of a trusted heart. In the early mornings, she gathered eggs from beneath warm hens, careful not to startle them. At first her hands shook, afraid she might crack what she was meant to protect. But Samuel had shown her once, only once, how to slide her palm gently beneath feathers and lift without fear. You move like you expect things to break, he had said, not unkindly. Try moving like you expect them to hold. She had thought about that sentence for days. Now she moved differently. The chickens clucked softly around her boots, and she found herself whispering small apologies when she startled them. The basket filled slowly with pale brown shells, each one a fragile promise. Later, Samuel taught her to ride. The mare was patient, the color of toasted bread, with dark eyes that seemed to measure truth. Eliza approached cautiously, remembering how easily strength could intimidate. Samuel stood nearby, but did not take control. Let her know you are not afraid, he said. Even if you are. Eliza placed her small hand against the mare's neck. The warmth surprised her, the steady breathing. She mounted awkwardly the first time, nearly slipping sideways. Samuel did not laugh. He only steadied the saddle and said again, even if you are. By the third afternoon, she could guide the mare in slow circles around the yard. The wind lifted her hair free from its ribbon, and something inside her lifted too. Not pride, something quieter. Capability. Mrs. Carter visited often, bringing jars of preserved apples or fresh-baked bread wrapped in cloth. She watched Eliza from the porch with a knowing softness. The child is blooming, she told Samuel one evening as the sun dipped low. You can see it in the way she stands now. Samuel nodded, but did not claim credit. Blooming was not forced here. It was allowed. Benji, for all his forgetfulness, proved a gentle presence. He taught Eliza how to whistle through her fingers, though she never quite mastered it. He told stories of coyotes that howled like grieving widows and once swore he had seen a mountain lion reading a newspaper by moonlight. She learned to laugh at his exaggerations. Her laughter surprised her most of all. It felt like discovering a song she had forgotten she knew. Weeks passed, and the town of Briar's Hollow began to take notice. When Samuel rode in for supplies, Eliza sometimes accompanied him. She sat straighter in the saddle now, hands steady on the reins. Whispers followed them, though softer than before. That's the girl he chose. Samuel greeted townsfolk with the same quiet nod he always had. He did not defend his decision. He did not justify it. He lived it. One afternoon, as they loaded sacks of flour into the wagon, a familiar voice cut through the murmur of the market. Mr. Reed. Horace Calloway stepped forward, coat immaculate despite the dust. His eyes flicked toward Eliza with the same calculating glance she remembered from the chapel yard. So this is the little one, he said. Eliza felt the old tremble begin in her fingers, but she kept them still. She'll be more trouble than she's worth come winter, Calloway continued lightly. Girls tend to be. You can still return her, I expect. Mrs. Hale would understand. The words fell casually, as though she were a borrowed tool. Samuel did not raise his voice. He did not square his shoulders or flare his temper. He simply placed the final sack into the wagon and turned slowly. She is not a thing to return, he said. The statement was calm, firm, unadorned. Calloway scoffed, shrugged, and tipped his hat before walking away. But Eliza had heard. She carried those words with her all the way home. That night, the sky burned orange and pink as if the horizon itself were aflame. They sat on the porch after supper, boots resting against the rail. The world seemed wide and quiet enough to hold honest questions. Eliza gathered her courage carefully. Why did you choose me? The question left her lips barely louder than the crickets beginning their evening chorus. Samuel did not answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the fading light. You were standing the straightest, he said at last. She frowned slightly. There were taller boys. He shook his head gently. Not in height. She waited. You were shaking, he continued. I could see in your hands. But you did not step back. You did not shrink. He paused, searching for words as carefully as he would mend a torn saddle strap. Most folks think bravery is loud. It isn't. Sometimes it's just staying where fear expects you to run. Eliza swallowed hard. No one had ever described her that way. At the orphan house, she had been quiet, useful, unremarkable, not brave. You saw that, she whispered. I did. Silence followed, but it felt full, not empty. Something inside her loosened then, like a knot pulled too tight for too long. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She did not sob. She did not hide. She simply let them fall. Samuel did not rush to comfort her with grand gestures. He did not offer awkward pats or forced reassurance. He sat beside her, present, and that presence was steadier than any embrace. In the weeks that followed, winter hinted at its arrival. Frost dusted the fence rails at dawn. The cattle huddled closer at night. One morning, a heifer struggled in the barn, her labor slow and uncertain. Samuel called for Eliza to bring warm water. She hesitated only a moment before stepping into the stall. The air smelled of hay and sweat and something deeper, life pressing forward. Samuel guided her hands gently. Steady now. Life needs calm to enter the world. Eliza held the cloth, wiped the calf clean as it stumbled into its first breath. The tiny creature shivered, then steadied on trembling legs. She felt something awaken in her chest. Strength did not always roar. Sometimes it knelt in straw and wiped mud from a newborn's eyes. By spring, the town no longer looked at her as the orphan girl. They looked at her as Samuel Reed's daughter. The word traveled slowly at first, then more naturally. Daughter. Mrs. Carter used it one afternoon without thinking. You mind your pa now, she said with a wink. Eliza froze. The word hovered in the air between her and Samuel like a fragile bird. Pa. She had never spoken it. Not for anyone. That evening, as the sun slid behind the fields and painted the barn in gold, she stood beside him watching the horses settle for the night. The wind tugged gently at her braid. Pa. The word slipped out before she could reconsider. Soft, uncertain, almost swallowed by the breeze. Samuel went still. He did not turn quickly. He did not let the moment fracture under surprise. Yes, he answered, voice low and steady. Her throat tightened. She had expected something dramatic. Tears. A declaration. Instead, there was quiet acceptance, as though the word had always belonged there. She stood a little taller then, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she no longer felt the need to shrink. The prairie stretched endless beyond the fence line, vast and unafraid. Eliza rested her hands on the wooden rail, fingers no longer trembling. She had not been rescued. She had been seen. And somewhere between gathering eggs and riding beneath open skies, between storms and sunsets, she had learned something profound. Home was not built in a day of choosing. It was built in the staying. And for the first time in her young life, Eliza understood the shape of belonging. It was quiet. It was steady. It did not vanish when the wind changed direction. It remained. Spring should have come singing. Instead, it arrived thin and uncertain. The clouds gathered, but did not break. The wind carried dust instead of rain. Fields that once shimmered in green began to fade into brittle shades of brown. The creek narrowed until stones showed their backs like tired bones. Drought moves quietly at first. It does not shout its warning. It simply withholds. Samuel rose earlier each morning, walking fence lines with a slower step. He measured the sky as though it were a promise that had not yet decided whether to keep itself. Eliza watched him from the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin cup gone cold. She had grown taller over the winter. Her shoulders no longer curved inward. But she knew the look in his eyes. Worry. The cattle grew restless. The grass thinned. Neighbors rode past more often, their greetings edged with concern they tried not to name. One afternoon, as Samuel returned from town, his jaw was tighter than usual. Mrs. Carter had heard the murmurs. Benji had repeated them without meaning harm. You should have taken a strong boy, they say. Would have helped more in a dry year. The words floated through the yard like ash. Eliza pretended not to hear. But at night, when the house lay quiet and the wind scratched at the shutters, those murmurs crept beneath her door. Strong boy. Worth more. Return her. She had learned to stand straight while trembling. But fear remembers old pathways. One evening, just beyond sunset, hooves sounded at the edge of the property. Horace Calloway dismounted near the gate, his coat crisp despite the dust that claimed everything else. He approached the porch with the air of a man offering solutions that serve himself best. Evening, Reed. Samuel stood slowly from his chair. Calloway glanced toward Eliza, who lingered near the doorway. Dry season's hard on small spreads, he said. I could use another pair of hands. You'd ease your burden, letting her come work for me. Good food, solid roof. Might even be best for the child. The word burden fell gently, but deliberately. Samuel did not look at Calloway. He looked at Eliza. She could not read his expression. The silence stretched too long. Finally, Samuel spoke. She is not leaving. Calloway shrugged lightly. Pride's expensive in a drought. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving dust swirling in his wake. That night, Eliza lay awake long after the lantern burned low. She replayed the scene again and again. Pride's expensive. What if Calloway was right? What if love did not fill empty wells? What if she was the reason Samuel's shoulders seemed heavier these days? She rose before dawn. The sky held a pale gray stillness, neither night nor morning. She dressed quietly, folded the quilt at the foot of her bed, and placed her few belongings back into the small suitcase she had once carried from the chapel yard. Some habits never fully leave. She stepped outside barefoot, boots in her hand so they would not scuff the porch boards. The land felt colder than she remembered. She walked toward the far fence line, the one that met open prairie without barrier. The horizon lay wide and unforgiving ahead. If she left before he woke, it would be easier. Less arguing, less disappointment. Better to choose absence than risk being returned. Her chest tightened, but she kept walking. Halfway to the fence, she heard it. Her name, carried on a voice that did not shout, but did not waver. Eliza. She stopped, turned slowly. Samuel stood near the barn, half forgotten in his hand, hair stirred by the morning wind. He did not run toward her. He did not demand. He walked, each step steady. When he reached her, he did not stand towering above. He knelt, bringing himself level with her eyes, just as he had the day he chose her. Where are you going? He asked softly. She could not hold his gaze. I thought, she began, then faltered. Thought what? That I was making it harder, she whispered. They say you should have taken a strong boy. I heard them. I heard Mr. Calloway. Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything. The wind passed between them, lifting strands of her hair across her cheeks. Samuel listened without interruption. Then he reached forward and gently took the suitcase from her hand, setting it down in the grass. I did not raise my hand to lower it later, he said. Her breath caught. You think drought scares me, he continued quietly. Or whispers. Or men who measure worth by muscle. He shook his head slowly. You're not something I kept because I could not do better. You were someone I chose because I saw better. Her eyes filled. When I raised my hand that day, I was not looking for labor, he said. I was looking for courage. And I found it standing at the end of a line, shaking but unbroken. The words settled over her like rain long overdue. You're not my burden, Eliza. You're my daughter. The word carried no hesitation. Daughter. She felt the last of her old fear crack apart like dry earth splitting under sudden storm. I was afraid, she admitted. So was I, he replied. That startled her. Choosing someone is always a risk, he said, but it is one worth taking. The sky shifted above them. A low rumble rolled across the distance. They both looked upward. Clouds gathered, thick and heavy, no longer withholding. The first drop fell against her cheek, cool and certain. Then another. Then many. Rain poured down over the fields, over the barn roof, over the brittle grass that had waited too long. Eliza laughed through her tears as the earth drank deeply. Samuel stood and pulled her gently into his arms. Not tight enough to trap, just enough to anchor. She pressed her face against his shirt, no longer afraid of breaking. Pa, she said this time without trembling. Yes. They stood there as the rain baptized the land, washing dust from fences and doubt from hearts. The drought did not end that day entirely. There would still be work. There would still be worry. But something had shifted deeper than weather. The ranch survived the season. Grass returned in stubborn patches of green. Calves grew stronger. Even Calloway's glances softened, though pride kept him silent. In town, people began to speak differently. That Ree girl, they said, tough as prairie grass. Eliza no longer felt the need to stand straighter than her fear. She simply stood. One evening, months later, she sat beside Samuel on the porch once more. The sunset spilled gold across the horizon, as it had on the day she first asked why he chose her. The wind felt familiar now, like an old friend. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder. He did not speak. He did not need to. Belonging had never been loud. It had been steady. And so, dear reader, if you have ever stood at the end of a line believing no one would raise their hand for you, remember this. Worth is not decided by who overlooks you. It is revealed by who sees you. Some souls are not unwanted. They are simply waiting for the right eyes to recognize their quiet bravery. If this story touched something tender inside you, take a moment. Tell me, where are you watching from? Have you ever felt unseen? Leave your thoughts below. Like this story, share it with someone who needs reminding that they are not a burden, but a blessing. And subscribe so we may sit together again by this old prairie fire and remember that somewhere, even now, a hand is still being raised for someone who thinks they have been forgotten.